About 2 years ago, my producer just called me out of the blue and he goes, "Do you have anything written based on water?" And I'm like, "No, why?" And he goes, "Well, I've got access to a giant tank. So could you write something based on water?" And, basically the inspiration was him having access to a tank. And once you sort of go down that road, you start thinking, well, it's probably got to be a shark film. What's the best shark film ever made? Jaws. What's the best scene in Jaws? Arguably, it's the USS Indianapolis monologue by Quint. And, I think filmmakers have been waiting for somebody to make that film for many decades. And I'm just like, all right, well, I'm going to put my hand up to make a version of that can be harrowing, but also adventurous. I didn't want to make the American version of that because I didn't have the budget. And quite frankly, I'm not sure it's my right to tell that story as an Australian. But I did find a true story based or inspired, and I was inspired by that true story of the sinking of the HMAS Armidale in 1942, halfway between Darwin and Timor, where an Australian warship on its way to fight the Japanese in 1942 was sunk by Japanese Zeros, and hundreds of Australian soldiers went into the water and a lot of them got eaten by sharks. So I did a deep dive researching that and was sort of inspired by a lot of the real actual events, that occurred during that horrific tragedy in Australian, war history. And out the back of that came Beast of War. Well, obviously the significance is, it was inspired by a true event that actually happened. And, there were a lot of cases where, ships were sunk all over the world in all different countries and men went into the water. And when there's a lot of blood and kicking bodies in the water, that attracts sharks. So, that's significant on two levels. It's significant that it's based on real events, but it's also, you don't really get a more amazing riff on the shark film than sharks in the context of war, because then you get to mix two genres in one. You've got the subgenre of the monster shark film and you've got the war film genre. So you're working kind of on two levels there. And, that's really good, like, fodder for really intense dramatic action. But also there's a personal significance for me too. I've always wanted to do a film set in World War II. I'm emotionally connected to that because my grandfather was killed in World War II and my great-grandfather was killed in World War I. So, my family has a long history of dying in world wars. And I had access to my grandfather's letters home from war. This film is dedicated to Jim Roach, my grandfather. And, I got to know him personally through the letters, and I got to sort of put a little bit of his charisma and personality into the lead character of Leo Bennett, played by Mark Cole-Smith. So, there's a few pieces of significance there in terms of, wanting to craft like a really dynamic story, but also having a personal connection. So, yeah, the World War II thing was pretty important for me. It's not too difficult to make a B movie. Like, you just get a monster and it eats people, and maybe somebody survives, maybe somebody doesn't. But like, it's pretty easy to make a piece of entertainment based on that premise. But if you don't work in a lot of character and really decent storytelling and emotional arcs into that monster context, you just end up with a B movie. And, to me, my favorite thing is when you take a B movie context and really, really try and make it with an eye towards A movie storytelling. The reason why Jaws is so good, or The Exorcist, or The Thing, or Alien, is that they're all B-movie premises, but directed by storytellers and filmmakers who are working at the top of their game. So it's so important to work in all this character work and good, decent storytelling into the context of the monster, because otherwise you don't care about the characters. And you know, that's why in this film, in Beast of War, it was so important for me to start with this immediate emotional connection to the beast. You know, you learn very quickly on in the film, in a dream sequence, that our lead hero, Leo, played by Mark Goldsmith, has some kind of a connection where a loved one has been killed by a shark previously. So there's a shark already in his nightmares that he's battling with, and then when the shark pops up later on in the film, you know, he's got to deal with the shark in a physical context, in a contemporary setting, but also the demon in his mind, and work through the guilt of you know, allowing his brother to be killed by a shark in the flashbacks. But also, you know, we start with, you know, a good 15, 20-minute sequence, the training sequence, where these young blokes were sent out into the jungles near Darwin, and they were trained to be soldiers. And during that training sequence, you learn who they are, and you see them bond, and you see, you know, Leo and Will, you know, the two co-leads, you know, form kind of like a brotherly bond. You see that there's a character called Des, who's a bit of a racist bastard, and you know, he wants to be the alpha, but you know, throughout the narrative, he needs to learn to stop being a bastard, and you know, he learns to understand that, you know, he may have racist tendencies, but at the end of the day, a person of color is the guy who's going to lead them through this, and turns out to be the true hero and a true man of integrity. And so he has to change his ideals through the shaping of the narrative. So all of these different things that sort of wend their way through the story are important, because if anything's going to lift this out of a B-movie context, it's that kind of character work. So it's very important to get that right. The smaller roles were not too difficult to cast. Me and Blake Northfield know some of the best actors in the country, and you know, a lot of these guys we've worked with before, and so we just handpick them and say, do you guys want to spend 5 weeks on a raft getting munted by sharks? And most of them, you know, said, oh, we get to do a war film and get eaten by a shark, that sounds great, let's do that. So you know, that wasn't hard. The lead character of Leo, I wrote that for Mark Goldsmith. I think he's one of the best actors in Australia. He's certainly one of the best actors I've ever worked with, and I've wanted to work with him for years and years. So I wrote this character for him specifically. And honestly, I didn't really know what we'd do if he said no. I would have been pretty stuffed. Yeah, he's got a real star quality. You know, he's got a bit of a Bob Mitchum kind of star quality. He's just the charisma and the talent, and you know, the commitment to his craft just explodes off the screen. And he's a really strong swimmer, and he can do all his own stunts. So I really needed him to say yes, and thank God he did. The part of Will, played by Joel Nankervis, was very difficult to cast. We went through hundreds of young blokes, and like, it was very hard to find somebody who ticked all the boxes we needed. Like, he needed to have a kind of, you know, he needed to be a kind of good-looking leading man type. He needed to have a period vibe to him. He needed to resonate with intelligence, vulnerability, and the possibility of heroism when he makes his turn from sort of this scared young bloke into a hero. And he also needed to be able to act really well. And so those are a lot of boxes that you need to tick for somebody who needs to look 17. There's not too many actors who look 17 who can pull all of those things off. So when we found Joel, I was just like, oh, thank God we have a movie. Yeah, and so that was basically the casting process. Like 80% practical, maybe 20, 15% digital. Anytime you see it in a wide shot underwater, it kind of has to be digital, because, you know, you can't really make an animatronic do that unless you have $3 million. um, um, and so, yeah, no, it was very important for me that the shark was mostly practical. I see a lot of shark films come out in the last 10 years, and they're all digital because it's just easier to make it digital. But I don't think they look real. I think the sharks move too quickly, and the water displacement is always wrong. It just, you don't feel the weight of the thing. And, you know, I love good CG. Don't get me wrong. You watch a film like Dune and you're like, oh my God, like the CG in movies like that are phenomenal. But sometimes you just have to go practical. And when you've got like a shark, which is effectively a creature that weighs a ton moving through a big body of water, it's hard to get that right digitally. And so it's better just to build an animatronic creature that can move through the water, and then the water displacement and the wave wakes that break on either side of the fin just look real. And so when you've got, like, you know, this giant animatronic attack head, you know, working on rails underneath the water that kind of explodes up out of the water, and all of this liquid, you know, just like explodes everywhere, and you know, the creatures, you know, the puppet head is interacting, you know, with the performers. It just feels and looks real. And I think it's really important when you're doing a horror film that, you know, your monster feels texturally interactive. And so I'm glad that we, you know, spent all that time and money and effort making sure that we had like a real creature. And I thought the company Formation FX did just such a fantastic job. I think it's one of the best sharks I've seen on screen, and we were very happy with the results. I mean, that's always the hardest aspect of making a shark film. Like, you kind of have to be in and around water like 90% of the time. Um, we When we realized that we had to do it in studio in Australia, that kind of meant two things. One, we'd have to build our own tank because there's no indoor tank in Australia big enough to hold the vision that we had. So we had to build our own 40-meter tank with almost 2 million liters of water in it. And that was just a gigantic production effort to organize that, especially on indie budget. And the other thing it did was it sort of defined the look and feel and style of the film. I've made the decision then to kind of fill the studio with fog so that, you know, most of the time we don't have to really worry about the edge of the tank because it just disappears in the fog. So I could just shoot practically. We just filled a studio with fog for 5 weeks and just shot and shot and shot. I didn't have to worry about, you know, volume screens or blue screen too much of the time. It was just about how do we light the fog to make sure that there's a point of difference, and so that it doesn't get sort of visually boring after a while. And the way we did that was to stylistically change the color palette. Like, every scene basically has a different look. You know, it goes from these, you know, dusky, beautiful, deep blues to kind of these amazing pink sunrises, you know, into these blood red sunsets, these beautiful, you know, sort of yellow Kurosawa like sunsets. And then at night, we had the idea to put bioluminescence in the water so that the water glowed neon green from below. So, you know, visually, hopefully, the film is never boring. But yeah, that was all just an offshoot of having to shoot indoors in an indoor tank so that we could control the environment. Because the one thing you don't want to be doing is shooting on open water, because then you've got to worry about, you know, rain and storms and currents and people drowning and sharks. Because if you're shooting at night in Australia on open water, there's a lot of sharks out there. And I didn't really want to make a shark movie and have somebody actually eaten by a shark. That would be a horrible irony. So I'm glad that we did it, you know, basically in a giant heated pool. I like the idea that they'll see this inspired by true events title card at the start and Google what actually happened to the Armadale, because the heroism of what those boys had to go through was pretty amazing. But at the end of the day, really, one of the things I love about Jaws is, it's a horror film and it's a brilliant piece of cinema and it's really beautifully written and acted and all of those things. But at its core, it's just a really well-made adventure film. This is a film where a filmmaker kind of went, I'm going to make Lawrence of Arabia with a shark. And I loved that it's just an epic adventure with a fin. And I kind of wanted to try and do an indie version of that. So all I really want is for people to be entertained by this. And, my bar really was to just not embarrass myself in the shadow of Jaws. And if audiences come out of it kind of going, that was a decent shark film, like, that's good enough for me. It's actually another World War II film. I can't really talk about it too much, but yeah, it's looking like we're going to start filming very early in 2026. It's set on the Eastern Front this time. There's a European setting rather than an Australian setting. But I just so enjoyed working in, I just enjoyed making a war film. I absolutely loved it. And I found writing it to be really easy. I just connected into that world as a writer director, like, very much. And I kind of wanted to expand on working in that space. So yeah, it's another war film for me next, which I'm looking forward to.